Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shauketaly.
And a very good evening to you and welcome to Newsline Live. Today we are in conversation with Ms. Tamara Kunanayakam, former diplomat and also at one time Sri Lanka's representative to Geneva, the United Nations in Geneva, amongst a host of other things. Outspoken but to the point. Here she is, Ms. Tamara Kunanayakam. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Faraz.
Thank you very much for being on the program. Can you make it very clear as to what you did? You were the permanent representative, you were an ambassador for Sri Lanka?
Yes, and I was also chairing negotiations as chair of the UN Working Group on the Right to Development.
Right.
And I also worked for 10 years within the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and some 15 years within the UN as a whole.
I want to ask you, in light of what's happened in Geneva this time round and so on, but also a question that goes back to perhaps the end of the war. So we're like 12 years later. What's the paranoia about having an investigation into international concerns on allegations of war crimes, departures of due process in terms of the fight against the LTT? So what's the paranoia about having an investigation to have a look, see? After all, it's for the benefit of the people of our country, and it was our war. It was probably not fought in other parts of the world. It was fought here in Sri Lanka. So what's the paranoia about trying to find out the truth?
Well, the real issue is that the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, whether it's the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly, does not have the authority to substitute itself for the member states. This is a state responsibility for protecting human rights of the citizens of the country, or the right, whether it's economic, social, cultural, political rights, are the right of the people of the country. So that's the right to self-determination. The United Nations does not have the authority to intervene in the internal affairs of states. And that is, those are the principles of the UN Charter. So the problem in the case of Sri Lanka is because the UN has become, human rights has become a weapon used by the powerful states. Particularly, I've said this several times, since the collapse of the socialist bloc, the US emerging as the hegemonic power has been using the human rights as a way to expand and to consolidate its hegemony, global hegemony, and to impose on the rest of the world a system, a global order that is under its own leadership, which is contradictory to the global order under the UN Charter, which is based on sovereign equality. Right. So the Sri Lanka, the problem in the case of Sri Lanka is that it is seeking to impose on Sri Lanka a particular model and to force Sri Lanka to join the global alliance that the US is organizing. Right now it is to counter China, which it sees as a threat to its global hegemony. So the target's primary adversary is China and Russia. And Russia has become a target only in order to get the support of the European Union to, in exchange, that the US tells the EU, well, you have to support us against China, in return we'll protect you against Russia. So they have created a bogey, a Russian bogey, as a threat, which it isn't.
But some of the actions of the UN seems to me to be at odds with good democratic processes, if I may put it that way. For example, the United Nations has announced a budget of around $2.8 million to set up an office to collect evidence for future use, if you like, on Sri Lanka. The only other place that has sort of managed to enter the sort of to have the kudos of having an office against them is Syria. And honestly, do you think that the violations that are going on in Syria, okay, that warrants it anyway, but where does Sri Lanka come in between all this? What about a office, special office with an even larger budget, perhaps, against the state of Israel? Because there is daily human rights abuses of the Palestinian people. That's just one tiny way of saying it. Very recently as well, whilst we were talking here, the Americans were bombing Syria. So who's going to check all that? And really, does Sri Lanka warrant a $2.8 million plus spend when we too are contributing to that?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's warranted in the case of Syria and not warranted in the case of Sri Lanka, because it's the setting up. This is not criminal investigations, and acting as a prosecutor is not within the mandate of the General Assembly or of the Human Rights Council. The Charter does not allow for that function. The only organ that has the authority to do that is the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the Charter, which is applied then in case there's a breach of international law, there's a threat to, sorry, not international law, there's a threat to international peace and security or an act of aggression. And only in that situation can the Security Council even call for the ICC to look into the violation of criminal investigation or create an ad hoc tribunal. Now, in the case of on the case of Syria, it has not been able to do that because there has been the Security Council does not think that it is warranted, and there has been the veto by China and Russia, and the United States has therefore moved it out of the Security Council to the General Assembly. Now, what they're trying to do is they want to do something that they're not allowed to do under the UN Charter, and the adoption by the General Assembly of a resolution that sets up a mechanism on Syria, which is called the Independent Impartial Mechanism.
Yes, the IIM.
Yes, M on Syria, is to investigate and prepare the evidence and preserve evidence in order to be used then against Syria in any jurisdiction, national or regional or otherwise, future or present, to be used against Syria. So this is completely a violation of the UN Charter. In the case of Sri Lanka, I would like to. It's exactly the same language that is used in the office of the report of the High Commissioner and the resolution itself. The resolution in the case of Syria is to collect, consolidate, preserve and analyze evidence of violations of international humanitarian law. In the case of Sri Lanka, it's to collect, consolidate, analyze and preserve information and evidence to develop possible strategies.
So it's just only a displacement of words, but
yes,
it's
and in
about
this
the
case,
same thing.
Even the General Assembly has no authority to set up such a mechanism, and the Human Rights Council even less so. So this is
So what is this then? Is it just a full toss, or is it designed for vexatious sort of...
No, it is to put pressure on the Sri Lankan government because they have an objective, and the objective is to use Sri Lanka, its strategic location as well as its resources to achieve the hegemonic objectives and ambitions of the United States in our region. So China is the primary adversary, and as we know, they have been trying to impose on Sri Lanka those 3 defense agreements. One is the AXA, the other is the MCC, and the third is the SOFA.
Yeah.
So this is only a means to exercise pressure on Sri Lanka to achieve their objectives. So,
but they're not paying for it.
See, this is the problem.
They just offered us a measly $500 million. What is $500 million? I mean, it's nothing. This group's worth more than that.
But this is why I think it's important that Sri Lanka continues. This is not over. This is only the beginning. If Sri Lanka does not pursue the matter at the General Assembly, because it's the General Assembly at the end of this year that will meet in about 5 months, that will decide on the budget. Now, the 2.8 million and more plus for 13 new staff members at a very senior level to do this work, which is to prepare evidence to be used in national jurisdictions in the Western countries, because that's where it's happening, to try Sri Lankans in their courts we will be paying for it if we don't challenge this at the General Assembly. So the 5th Committee of the General Assembly is where there is the discussion on the budget. And if we don't do that, if we do not challenge that, as for instance was done in the case of the Syrian mechanism, is that the Russian Federation moved a draft resolution to remove all the references to this Syrian mechanism, which is similar to the Sri Lankan one. And I must say, Sri Lanka abstained from that. Sri Lanka should have supported the draft resolution.
Why do you think our policy was to abstain?
It was as recently as 2020, after the present government came into power. That reflects the neutral, so-called neutral foreign policy that we have adopted, which is as opposed to the non-aligned foreign policy, in which if we had a non-aligned foreign policy, then we would stand together with non-aligned countries and prevent and ensure that there is not a return to colonization or foreign domination, which is what these resolutions do, because it allows the courts, because these are Western courts that practice extraterritorial jurisdiction. It is they who will try Sri Lankans or Syrians or any other country. That's why I wouldn't want to compare these countries, because the problem is that they're trying to set up a new precedent internationally that permits the powerful countries to try citizens of other countries in their own courts. So we're back to a situation of colonization. So if we don't, we have to stand up, and if we were following a non-aligned policy, we would have defended, we would have, in the case when other fellow non-aligned countries are threatened, then we would have supported those countries. But since we are neutral, neutral meaning that we are in fact, in reality, we are with the United States. We don't want to confront the United States, which is what happened in the case of Syria when we abstained. In fact, we abstained on the General Assembly resolution that established this Syrian mechanism. This was in 2016, and subsequently the Russian Federation moved this draft to remove references to the mechanism in the budget, because it involves Syria did not agree to setting up this mechanism, like Sri Lanka didn't. Sri Lanka didn't consent to the establishment of this mechanism because we called for a vote. So Sri Lanka, and on the other hand, the Charter provides, in order to promote human rights, can only be done through international cooperation and respect for sovereignty and equality between countries. You cannot impose on countries a mechanism that violates that sovereignty of those countries. So Sri Lanka should have stood up in that situation, should have in the case of Syria. It's not about Syria, it's about us, and it's about all the countries like us that are within the non-aligned movement. Now, if Sri Lanka had pursued a non-aligned foreign policy, we would have had those 14 countries that abstained at this council, we would have had them with us. But they abstained. But they should have been with us. So this is why the West was able to have the resolution adopted, with 22 in favor, Western countries and pro-Western countries in favor. But this is because we failed to adopt a non-aligned foreign policy. And I do hope that the government will start looking at the mistakes they made. Where did they go wrong? And what is neutrality? What does neutrality mean? I mean, the foreign secretary went on record calling 9 other non-aligned countries that were also victims of the same Western countries at the session that just finished, the Human Rights Council. He accused those countries of also being dictatorships under military rule and civil war. Now these are countries like our country, like Sri Lanka. We have no right to judge those countries because we are also the victims of those same countries. So if you take a position that is really against the potential allies, and the same applies if we did follow a non-aligned policy, we would have got the support of the Islamic states.
Now then, it's now time to have a quick look at the headlines, waiting to see what's on the primetime news this evening at 9 o'clock. When we come back, let's see if we can get beyond the waffle and the talk and see how the people of Sri Lanka may suffer from the latest rounds of talks at the United Nations in Geneva. See you on the other side of this break. And welcome back to Newsline Live. We're in conversation with Ms. Tamara Kunanayakam, formerly a diplomat and having represented Sri Lanka at the United Nations and so on. Ms. Kunanayakam, can I ask you, we've spent, there's a lot of talk, every year there's a lot of talk around Geneva and so on, and usually after the resolution or after the meeting, our foreign officials tend to go off to sleep, into slumber, Rip Van Winkle type of sleep, and the media is full of talk and all that. What's the actual implications for the people of Sri Lanka if we don't have this mechanism of accountability, at least an investigation? What awaits the people of Sri Lanka?
Well, what the problem with this resolution is, yes, Sri Lanka must investigate if there have been violations of humanitarian or human rights inside the country during the wartime. That is up to Sri Lanka as a sovereign state to do that, and it's up to the people of Sri Lanka to exercise pressure on their political leadership to do that, to do precisely that. But it is not, the problem with the UN is that it is not the UN, let's be clear, it is not the United Nations, it is the United States and its allies, and these are NATO allies. And their objective is very different. Their ambitions are not to promote international peace and security, but the contrary. Right. So we should not be used. That is the problem. Cannot be used and should not be used to achieve their objectives, which have nothing to do with Sri Lanka, the rights of the Sri Lankan people. And that is up to the Sri Lankans to do it. But the issue is, yes, we have to exercise pressure within Sri Lanka, but it's not up to the Western countries who cannot teach Sri Lanka about human rights violations or about war crimes, because they have been bigger war criminals than Sri Lanka. So they have no right and they have no authority under the Charter to do it.
But Ms. Kunanayakam, if I put it to you this way, that even one violation of any person's human rights is one too many. Isn't there a moral obligation on the part of our government to check and investigate whether in fact our forces acted with real bona fide interest in fighting a terrorist organization without breaking any international laws to which we have also subscribed to in some shape or form?
The UN Charter is very clear about promotion and protection of human rights of citizens of sovereign states. You have an obligation to promote and protect your own citizens, and there is an obligation for other countries to cooperate with you in order to help you, to assist you to fulfill your responsibilities. But they cannot substitute themselves for the state. The people have the right to self-determination, and people must organize themselves, and they have to challenge their own government. And our political leadership, the political parties, instead of going off on a communal line and ethnic lines, they should be addressing the concerns of the people. And it's the absence, in a way, by not doing that, they allow such interventions from outside, but it doesn't make external intervention acceptable.
Yes, but Sri Lanka has a almost innate ability to spectacularly use the wrong timing to announce. For example, this business about the banning of the burqa, the madrasas and so on, and the burial issue, all came back to back when there was concern amongst the Islamic nations that Sri Lanka wasn't acting quite fairly. So we seem to, why is that? Is that a breakdown in our Foreign Office?
No, I think there is a problem of a vision. Our political leadership has no vision, long-term vision for the country or for its people. It's on ad hoc nature, the decisions taken, especially with regard to foreign policy. You see it now, this neutral, non-aligned animal, we don't know what it is about. We don't know if it's animal, mineral or water. What we have seen now in this session makes it clearer what neutrality means, we started to negotiate with the adversary, with hostile countries, which means we alienated our non-aligned friends. And I must say, this resembles what happens this year, resembled 2012 when I was in Geneva. What happened there was the same thing. What we did was I didn't know that we were secretly negotiating with the United States.
So who was secretly in negotiation? Who were the officials?
There was a section of the government that was secretly negotiating.
Can you tell us who?
I was not.
Is it fair to say?
Well, I think those same people are in the present government too.
Oh, better not say it then.
So there are if we had a clear foreign policy, we would not have been negotiating with the adversary, because they are the ones who want to impose a resolution on you. So you have to mobilize your friends. So, and the moment you negotiate with them, our friends in the non-aligned movement would say, okay, they are negotiating. Sri Lanka is a sovereign state, so we should abstain. So we stay away. So this is what happened in 2012, and a resolution was adopted. Same thing happened here. We were negotiating. In fact, the UK representative, when they tabled the resolution, he said we had 4 meetings with the Sri Lankan government to negotiate. So of course the non-aligned countries know that we were negotiating. So they would stay away. Then, of course, we had, as you say, that we offended on the question of burials and cremation of the Islamic rites, and the burqa. It was not the moment to come up with that. What was the objective? We don't know. The other thing was the foreign secretary who goes off and attacks the non-aligned countries as being dictatorships, military rule, and instead of winning them over to us, because we have the same problem, we have the same issues, we have common interests. So we should have done that. So there were a number of situations like that. Or India, for instance, this was in 2012. The reason India voted against us in 2012 is because one of the members of our own delegation, after the Indians told us, don't make it public because we'll have problems with Tamil Nadu, that we are supporting you, because they were supporting us. That particular senior delegate coming from Sri Lanka made a public statement saying India is supporting us. The next moment, Tamil Nadu was up in arms, and the Lok Sabha, the parliament, the Indian parliament, was nearly collapsed. So they were closed down. The whole issue was shifted from the foreign ministry to the prime minister's office. It became a political issue, and India had to vote against us. At least we gave them a pretext to vote against us. This time we have the foreign secretary going and telling, and again doing the same thing, going and telling the Indians that we have the support of India, when India itself hasn't said that they will support us.
Well, why did India abstain, do you think? Why didn't they support support Sri Lanka as part of their neighborhood first sort of policy?
I think it's important that we understand that we have to understand the global politics and the geopolitics. We have right now, the main issue is the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States to counter China, and it's to engineer regime change in China. And India is part of the quadrilateral, and it is a strategic partner of the United States, and its role is to bring the South Asia into the quadrilateral, at least in support of the US agenda. India is a strategic partner of the United States. If we don't realize that, then we will not understand why India took the position it took. And secondly, it's important that we understand that India may have abstained because this could also have implications for India in the future. Because if they agree to this kind of mechanism, it can be in the future, if India decides to go independent of the US strategy, they will use the same weapon against India. So, and there is also within India, there must be different forces, so which probably explains India. But we didn't help India.
In the short term, will there be implications to the people of Sri Lanka? Will there be, for example, GSP taken out or something like that?
What will happen now is this, if the budget is approved, the Office of the High Commissioner will become a prosecutor's office.
They will be preparing $2.8 million.
Yes, they will be preparing all the evidence, the cases for criminal proceedings in the courts, national courts of the Western countries, with the United States, the UK, Switzerland,
let's get this right. They can't do it themselves, the UN, and therefore they're going to collect all this data, whatever they can, and present it to these individual states, that they may then use it against Sri Lanka.
Yeah, but I would like to say who the they are. The they is the United States and their Western allies, because the UN is all the member states. So they use the UN precisely because the UN doesn't have a mandate to do that. It will, and it cannot do it through the Security Council because of the veto. They have established this universal, so-called universal jurisdiction, extraterritorial jurisdiction, which is in violation of the Charter, to permit those countries to do what the UN cannot do. So this is where Sri Lanka has to, and countries of the non-aligned movement, because they are all concerned with the same issue. They should counter this in the General Assembly, block the budget, and it's very clear. Simply Sri Lanka has not consented to the establishment.
Have you got professional, this is the last question, you got a few seconds. Has Sri Lanka's Foreign Office got enough professional career foreign diplomats who understand the nuances?
I think what is important is not so much the career diplomats, because they are only the implementing agency. There has to be a clear foreign policy. There has to be a clear foreign policy, and not something that is very ambiguous and anybody can interpret they want to. So this has to be very clear. Sri Lankan government, the government has to come out very clearly and say it's either non-aligned or it's pro-Western. There's no such thing as neutral.
Are you going to meet the president and tell him, or are you going to send him a copy of this?
I hope he will listen. He will be listening.
He watches us.
I don't know.
Right. Let's say. Otherwise, you can talk to him and send him the clip of what you're saying. But Tamara Kunanayakam, thank you very much for being on Newsline, and that's the way it was. It's now time for the primetime news from Newsfirst. Take care, and as always, God bless you.